Hi, I'm Jody Dworkin, a professor and extension specialist in the Department of Family Social Science at the University of Minnesota. I have been studying caregiver teen technology use and the role of technology in family relationships for more than 10 years now. If you haven't already seen the other two webinars, I'd encourage you to check those out as well. One is a literature review, and one includes a series of case study scenarios that you can work through either on your own or with a team of other caregivers or colleagues. You'll also find extensive resources on youth in care and social media use at the URL on this slide. This presentation is about 20 minutes. If you'd like to pause at any time, you can click on the double lines at the bottom left of the video screen. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start by thinking about what type of tech user you are. So are you an elite user, a middle of the road user, or do you have few tech assets? Whether you're a caregiver or are working with caregivers, how you feel about technology use and social media use in particular will undoubtedly influence how you react to and advise and work with families around technology use and social media use. So let's start by talking about the group that has few tech assets. Now these data are a bit older, so don't focus here too much on the percents. The percents can change. The goal is to really recognize that tech users come in a range of different capacities, and we all fall in different places along this continuum. So this first group that has few tech assets, they may have some technology, but it's not essential in their life. They use some tools some of the time. Some of those with few tech assets, they may be disconnected, they may just have limited skills or experiences, and they may not be as excited about tech use as some of the other groups we're going to look at. In contrast, are you an elite tech user? So this group of tech users has the most information, gadgets, devices, new services. They're always looking for the new tool that's coming out. I'm sure you can think of people you know who are like this if you are not like this yourself. They like the fast-paced features that come with cell phones. They may be online quite frequently. And there's some ways that they may be less excited about some technologies, but in general, they hold positive views about technology and the ways that it lets them keep up with others, do their jobs, learn new things. Somewhere in the middle of these two groups are the middle of the road tech users. So this group may fully embrace technology. They may like their cell phones, they may like the internet, they may like the connection that it provides, but they may not use these tools often. They may have a lot of technology. They may find it to be a burden some of the time, but this group is generally connected. So think about where you fall, because this will impact how you respond when you talk with a family or when you're working with teens. So pause here for a second. Think about what kind of tech user are you? How do you use technology in your own life? What does that mean to you? What does that look like? Are there ways that technology is beneficial for you? Or are there ways that you find technology might interfere with your life? Now, it's no surprise that teens are spending a lot of time using technology. I'm going to share some data on caregivers and teens. There's not comparable data for caregivers and youth in care. But what do parents and caregivers say about their teens' screen time? Well, about 2/3 worry about how much time their teen is spending on screens. 86% are very or somewhat confident they know how much time on the screen is appropriate. But only about over half say they limit screen time. So caregivers are saying they know what should happen. Many are not setting limits, but a lot are worried. It feels a bit confusing, maybe. It feels a bit like a contradiction. So how do we make sense of these data? If you're viewing this with others, you might pause here and talk about what might be going on. So perhaps teens are doing a good job of self-regulating, and caregivers don't need to set rules. Perhaps caregivers aren't sure how to set and enforce rules. Or perhaps they're scared to set rules because they think it might ruin or hurt the relationship with their teen. What other ideas do you have? How can caregivers overcome some of these challenges? What sorts of things have you seen families coping with? So pause here, and when you're ready to come back and continue on with the webinar, you can click play again. Now let's start to compare caregiver and teen tech use. Again, think back to your own tech use, and even if you're an infrequent user or someone who doesn't like technology, I'm sure that you can imagine many other caregivers you know who are frequent technology users and who really rely on technology. So what these data tell us is that 72% of parents say their teen is often or sometimes distracted by technology. And 51% of teens say their parent is often or sometimes distracted. So that's half. Half of teens are reporting that they're also finding parents are distracted by their cell phones. So if we have both parents and teens report being distracted and report that maybe it's interfering with their relationship, pause for a second and think about your own tech use. I'm sure we can all think of a time when we were distracted by technology, where maybe we had to ask somebody to repeat themselves or had to ask somebody to hang on a second because you were looking at your phone. You might hear words like technoference. There's a lot of words and language that are starting to emerge that describe the ways in which we're all being distracted by technology and the ways in which technology can interfere with our relationships. And what's important and what these data remind us is that it's not just teens who are distracted. So in a report from Common Sense Media, they report about a third of teens say they wish their parents would spend less time on their devices. Now, most of the emphasis has been on teens' tech use, and we're just now starting to talk about caregivers as also being distracted in these ways. So as we just saw, teens report caregivers are distracted, much more than caregivers themselves report being distracted. So over half of teens versus just 36% of parents report spending too much time on their cell phone. Are teens more self-aware of their tech use, or do parents just use technology less? We probably don't have that answer quite yet. Half of teens say parents are distracted, but parents aren't thinking they're spending as much time on their cell phones as their teens are. So caregivers can also be distracted but may not realize it. And what's happening is that they're modeling tech use for their kids. Caregivers don't have rules the way that teens tend to, and so it can be harder for a teen to either call out a caregiver, and caregivers are often very willing and often feel obligated to call out their teens, particularly in a public space or a space where it would be socially acceptable for a parent to say or a caregiver to say, I think you should put down your device. Caregivers report being distracted at work more than kids report being distracted at school. This is perhaps not surprising given that many schools will have rules about cell phones and kids then don't have to self-monitor. The school is doing that for them. But spend a minute looking at these data, because you can see that while teens are reporting, for example, checking their phone for messages as soon as they wake up, 44% are saying they do that often. About 26% of parents are saying the same thing. So let's probe a bit more into how caregivers are using technology. The research that is emerging from my team reveals how caregivers are using technology with their children, and they're using it for things that you might expect. So communication, for caregiving more broadly, to maintain family relationships, for monitoring, for checking in, and to communicate when they're not physically with the child. Perhaps not surprising, they're using the tools in their role as caregivers that they're using in general. So if you are a social media user, for example, that's the same tool you're likely to use to connect with your teen. But they're making intentional choices about media depending on who they're communicating and connecting with. So caregivers are relying on technology for caregiving, but also for their own needs as well. So things like social support and information seeking. And when we talk specifically about caregivers of adolescents, we find that they're very active users. So in the data that I've been collecting nationally, about 1/3 of parents of teens were identified as highly active tech users, meaning they're using a variety of devices, they're performing a range of different activities online daily, and only about 20% of parents were identified as limited tech users. So caregivers go online, they search for caregiving information, social support, to normalize their caregiving experience so that it's just not my kid type feeling that parents often have, to confirm that what they're doing is right. And in general, they report satisfaction with the resources they find. They still express some hesitation in trusting online resources and are looking for greater education in how to search for good resources and how to sort out the credibility of online information that they do find. So what is good information? What does that look like? How do I know if this is good or not? How do I find resources that really fit with my perspective and approach that I'm taking to parenting? Some of the things we find is that parents are much more likely to use texting, instant messaging, Skype for communicating with their children than for communicating with other family members, and more likely to use social networking sites for parenting than other types of online activities like blogging or chat rooms. They also use media, not surprisingly, with the people they're closest with. So parents really have a wide array of devices and tools that they're using, which makes the opportunities for connecting with teens much broader because they have a larger toolkit of things to choose from. Now, while most caregivers of teens didn't grow up with technologies that exist now, which is an interesting time and space that we're in, teens are rapidly adopting these new technologies as they emerge. So for the majority of parents of teens right now, they didn't have the same technologies that the teens they are caring for are growing up with. Now, one way to think about this, research has generally looked at how caregivers influence their children's use of media. And the fact that youth and young people are learning to use social media and new technologies before their caregivers often impacts and has the potential to disrupt what we think of as the traditional power structure in the family system. For today's caregivers of adolescents, technology is changing really quickly, and many caregivers can't anticipate what new technologies youth are going to use or even how they'll use them. And this complication by the fact that caregivers did not grow up with technology, it's reasonable to suspect that future generations may have a different experience. But for today's caregivers of teens, this is really uncharted territory and hard then to really stay ahead of the game. These new technologies that are introduced into the family system are a source of change. They can be a source of stress, and the family system somehow needs to respond to these changes. So when we think of young people and we think of teens as both intentionally and unintentionally influencing the decisions around technology that their caregivers and other family members are making. So for example, children can passively influence caregiving when a caregiver perceives that a tablet will benefit the child in school, for example, and purchases a tablet. Children can also be active influencers for when a teen, for example, persuades a caregiver to buy them the newest iPhone. So children are really socializing their caregivers into the use of these new media, which includes devices, so things like tablets and cell phones, as well as applications and tools such as texting, Instagram, TikTok. So if a child primarily is using text messaging to communicate, it's not unreasonable that a caregiver will start texting to also communicate with the child. Now, despite there being many examples of this reciprocal process being part of kind of normal adolescent development, for example, we see youth have often introduced music or fashion into the family system. Research has fallen a bit behind in specifically looking at how this happens within the context of media use and social media in particular. So this mirrors the general literature on caregiving that suggests a lot of what caregivers do is a reaction to child behavior. So caregiving around technology use is often a reaction to a teen's interest in and their use of these new emerging technologies. So even think about like radio or television or even the internet when it first emerged. Teens and young people may have been the first adopters, and then they introduced that to the family system. So again, children are not passive in this process. They are active agents in the family. They are both intentionally and unintentionally influencing caregivers and other members of the family system. Now, this child effect, or the idea that young people have an impact on the family system and impact to a great degree caregiving and the way that happens, is a perspective that has largely been ignored in media research, as I mentioned. When asked, both children and caregivers report that children guide their caregivers regarding how to use digital media. And this is especially true for newer media, so smartphones, tablets, apps. In families where there is more child influence, perhaps not surprising, there also seems to be more conflict about media. And this seems similar regardless of whose report you're getting, whether it's caregiver or a child report. What is interesting, though, is that we see children report having more of an influence on caregivers than caregivers actually report their children have on them. So while caregivers might recognize some influence of their children on their technology use, they either are not recognizing the full extent of that influence, or young people might be overestimating their influence. Think about your own family. Would you say that teens influence your technology use and teach you about new technology use and how to use different tools? So pause here for a moment and think about that. So think about your own family, think about families that you work with. How would you say teens influence technology use in the family? So one of the ways we see caregivers influencing their teens' technology use is by reacting, by responding to, engaging with what the teen initiates. So caregivers may monitor teens' use of technology and online behavior. They may make decisions about adolescents' access to technology, set rules about when a teen should have a cell phone, set guidelines about cell phone use based on family environment and values, based on the teen's past behavior. And technology also provides a somewhat less intrusive way for caregivers to check in with adolescents and for the adolescents to share information. And research suggests that this does matter. Finding ways to connect that work for both caregivers and teens is really important. One of the things we find in my research is that when caregivers are trying to know a lot about what's going on with teens, and the youth is also engaged with the internet more frequently, these online activities are perhaps one way that youth and caregivers are staying connected. It may be that parents and caregivers feel the need to work hard to stay connected when a young person is online so frequently. But it's also that when teens are online and when caregivers are trying to know what they're doing, there seems to be high relationship satisfaction. In contrast, when caregivers are not only trying to stay connected, but are really successful in doing so, it may be because the young person is willing to disclose. It may be that the young person is online less frequently. It may be that they're engaged in more personal interactions with caregivers. We also find some findings that are that don't always suggest positive outcomes. So we find that when teens are disclosing information online, we see positive associations with internalizing behaviors, so things like depression, but that's not associated with externalizing behaviors. And so we see that when youth initiate communication, so when youth are choosing to disclose, they may feel a greater sense of control. They may be more likely to disclose and share information, and may have a very different experience than when caregivers are initiating communication and trying to solicit information. Now, whether this happens online or in person, these boundaries are really blurry right now. I think as new technologies continue to emerge, we'll continue to learn more. Technology provides a way for some of this disclosure to happen in ways that can feel less intrusive to young people. And when young people are disclosing and caregivers have knowledge of what's going on, there are positive benefits for the family in terms of family communication, in terms of family relationships, and in terms of youth outcomes. So think about how you use technology to monitor your teen and communicate, or how the families that you're working with are using technology to monitor teens and communicate. Are teens reluctant to disclose using technology? Is technology being used as the primary way to ask questions and get information? What other ways can you accomplish those things? How might you talk with teens about their expectations and caregiver expectations for using technology, for checking in and sharing information? Try to get on the same page. You may be surprised that teens really want to talk in person about many topics. Pause here and think through some of these questions. If you're working through this with a group, spend some time talking through some of what you're seeing in either your own family or the families that you're working with. Thanks so much for joining us today. You can find more resources at this website below. Check us out online to get more information and view some additional webinars.